Good morning, Jaipur. How wonderful to see you all out this bright and early on a Sunday morning. But of course, this is not just any Sunday morning. This is your Sunday morning with Avi Shlaim. Now, before we begin, Jaipur, I have to confess to certain conflicts of interest here. And I'm just going to be honest with you. But I'm not a random interviewer with Avi Shlaim. We are old friends who go way back. I first met Avi when he was on the search committee that hired me to Oxford. You have a lot to answer for that.
It's the best appointment I've ever made. The best appointment.
He taught my wife at Oxford. He is the dream colleague of my 3.5 decades in Oxford. We have taken to the stage together many times before and never without provoking riot. So let me just warn you before we get started that there were certain things I had to acknowledge before we begin what should be an eventful conversation. Avi, how lovely to see you here in Jaipur.
It's lovely to see you here, Eugene, and it's so nice to see so many of you here. It's a pleasure to be here. Eugene and I have been colleagues for maybe 3 decades. He's the director of the Middle East Center at St. Anthony's College, where I was a fellow until I retired. So Eugene was my boss, and I had to obey his orders.
Never!
But he was also very useful to me because, as you may have noticed, he's an American. So I was able to say, some of my best friends are Americans.
And that's the first time I've heard that joke.
But I can no longer say that because Eugene was naturalized recently, so he's now British as well. But I still have to do what he tells me. I still have to please him because otherwise he wouldn't give me a good obituary.
Ooh! Without further ado, moving on quickly, the book in question, there are so many books that we could be talking about, but this is a very special and very intimate book, 3 Worlds. As the hardcover will tell you, I thought it was the best book I'd read all year.
How many books did you read?
This is a literary festival, Avi. I'm not going to understate. And I'd like to take them in the order of the 3 worlds that Avi writes about in a memoir of growing up between his birthplace in Iraq, the country of his adoption, Israel, and then the country in which he was to spend the longest part of his life, England and the United Kingdom. So, Avi, if you could for us, take us back to the Iraq of your childhood, recreate that world, and particularly the place of the very large and thriving Jewish community of Baghdad in which your family raised you.
So the first world of my book is Baghdad, where I lived from 1945 to 1950, and in 1950 my family and I moved to Israel. So we were Arab Jews. We were Iraqis whose religion happened to be Judaism. In this book, I tried to recreate a world that has completely vanished, a very different world, which preceded the birth of the State of Israel in 1948. In the Middle East, prior to 1948, there were thriving Jewish communities everywhere in the Arab world, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, and throughout North Africa. But the Jewish community in Iraq was the most ancient community, the most successful, the most prosperous, and the best integrated Jewish community into local society. And the Jews played a really active part at every level of nation building after the First World War. My family was an upper middle-class family. We were very privileged. My father was a very a wealthy merchant. We lived in a palatial house with servants. My parents had a sybaritic lifestyle, and we were very happy and well integrated in our society. And there were many minorities in Baghdad. The Jews didn't stand out in Iraq. The Jews were one minority among many, and there was a long tradition of religious tolerance and coexistence between the minorities. Europe had a Jewish problem. Iraq did not have a Jewish problem.
But I'd like you to focus now a little more specifically on your family. Introduce us to your mother, to your father. Your mother was one of your most important sources in writing this book. If you could just tell us a little bit about your mother and your father in Iraq.
My mother was called Mas'ouda, or Saida for short, and she went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which was a network of Jewish schools based in Paris. Throughout the Ottoman Empire, there were Jewish schools, and my mother at school learned 4 languages: English, French, Arabic, and Hebrew. But everything was taught through the language, through the medium of French. And when she was in her 90s, if anyone dared to suggest that she was dementing, she would recite Archimedes' law in French. She is the main source and the hero of my book, because there is a chapter in the book called My Baghdad, but my memories are very, very disjointed. And really, when I write about my Baghdad, it's what my mother told me about our life and our lifestyle in Baghdad. And
your father? Your father?
My father left school when he was 13, and he became a businessman. He was a self-made man, and he was very successful in business. He imported building materials from England, so he sold building materials, and many of the ministers in the Iraqi government were his clients. So they would order materials for the houses they built for themselves, and he didn't chase them up for payment. So it was a corrupt system, and they made it up for him. So he was a very successful businessman, but he was a lot older than my mother. My mother was 17, she was a schoolgirl when her family forced her to get married to my father, who was 42 years old. But she was very pragmatic. Having left school and got married, she made the most of her life as a lady of leisure and enjoyed life hugely in Iraq. The great turning point was 1950 when we moved to Israel.
But I'm going to bring you back to there. Let me keep you in Iraq for a moment before we go to your second world. There's a photo, I mean, it's a pity we don't have slides to share with you, but the book is full of family photos. And there's a picture of young Avi, age 4, in Baghdad. And he's wearing white trousers with a white shirt, and he's got a waistcoat on with brass buttons and a tie, and he's looking at you with the camera like the little prince of Baghdad. And I just wonder, Avi, if you have any memories of your own, of your childhood that was to be shattered 5 years after you were born in Baghdad.
I have very disjointed memories. One of my earliest memories is in the summer we used to sleep on the roof, and the servants would move beds to the roof, and I remember lying in bed and looking at the sky and looking at the stars, and Another memory is that I went to the balcony and looked downstairs at the large garden, and there were long tables with white tablecloths laden with food, and waiters in white jackets serving the guests.
Oh my God, the Little Prince of Baghdad indeed.
The thing that's so shocking is that in your family's lifetime, this very large, rich, well-integrated Jewish community was to be the target of an anti-Semitic pogrom just years before you were born, the Farhud of 1942. Your parents lived through that. Could you give us any sense of what the lived experience of the Farhud meant for the Jewish community of Baghdad?
The Farhud, the pogrom happened in the 1st and 2nd of June 1941.
I was off by a year. Crap historian. Take it over.
And the background was that Britain had been the colonial power in Iraq. In 1941, there was a nationalist uprising led by Rashid Ali al-Gailani, who is an Arab nationalist, and they kicked the British out of Iraq, and then Britain made a comeback into Iraq by sending 2 military forces to Baghdad. Now, the British ambassador to Iraq, Sir Kinahan Cornwallis, told the Iraqi army to stay outside Baghdad, not to go in, because he didn't want the Iraqis to say that the regent, the king was an infant, the regent, the monarchy was restored by British bayonets and reimposed on the Iraqi people. So he told them to stay out of Baghdad, south of the river, and it was then that there was no police, no security forces. Then there was a breakdown of law and order, and that's when the Farhud happened. An attack on Jews and the looting of Jewish premises. There were also atrocities, the rapes of Jewish women. And in Zionist historiography, the Farhud is taken as the proof that there was always anti-Semitism throughout the Arab and the Muslim worlds. And it is anti-Semitism that drove the Jews out of Iraq. And I dispute this narrative because the Farhud was not typical, it was a one-off. There was a long history of coexistence, of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Jews, and this was an aberration.
But can you talk about your family's experience? I mean, it must have been a very terrifying moment to see the city that you have made your life in suddenly rise up against your community.
So my mother was a 16-year-old girl, and her parents, her father was a British national, because her father was born in Bombay. My great-grandfather was a Jew, a businessman who went to Bombay and made a lot of money. He worked for the Sassoon family, who had an empire. To retire, he went back to Baghdad. My grandfather, Meir Obadiah, was 16 years old, and he always spoke Arabic with an Indian accent. And 2 of my uncles, my mother's brothers, my grandfather was an interpreter for the British consulate in Baghdad. And 2 of his sons, my uncles, were officers in British intelligence. They weren't military people. They were recruited as interpreters. And during the Farhud, my grandparents told my two uncles, take your younger sister, Mas'ouda, and go to somewhere safe. The British embassy wasn't safe, so they didn't go there. Instead, they went to the American embassy, and they spent the whole month when Rashid Ali and Gailani was in power in the American embassy. And my mother, who was had always made the most of any circumstances, had quite a good time as a 16-year-old girl. There was a very handsome American diplomat, and he used to give her, in the afternoons when people were snoozing in the garden, he used to give her Arabic, he used to give her English lessons. And she said to me, we flirted, but we didn't kiss.
It sounds like some of your mother's best friends were Americans too.
So my family didn't really suffer. And the point that I emphasize in my book is that it wasn't anti-Semitism which was the only driver of the Farhud. It was also British colonialism, because Sir Kinahan Cornwallis played a game of divide and rule, and there was so much resentment of Britain that he used the Jews as a scapegoat so that people could let off steam against the Jews. And my mother told me the story of, on the second day, lots of people, peasants, farmers from the outskirts of Baghdad came to Baghdad for looting. So it wasn't just anti-Jewish, but it was a lot of looting because of the breakdown of law and order. And my mother told me the story about the poor man who looted a large radio and took it to his shack where there was no electricity and no running water. And he banged on the radio and there was no sound. And he banged harder and he said, "Come on, you sing for the Jews, why don't you sing for us?" And my parents thought that Sir Kinahan Cornwallis was the real villain of the piece, and I think so too, and I try to prove that, but they couldn't pronounce his name, so they just called him Al-Kalb ibn al-Kalb, the dog and the son of a dog.
Oh, Avi, I have to stop you here, or else you're going to give this audience a very bad impression of British imperialism. Thank you, that was a cheap one, I know. Even more than the Farhud, Avi, it was going to be the creation of the State of Israel that would prove the beginning of the end of the Iraqi Jewish community. Could you give us some sense of how Zionism was viewed and how the creation of Israel was viewed from talking to your mother and to other members of the sort of Iraqi Jewish community in Ramat Gan?
My mother loved talking about the good old days in Baghdad. And during the 4 years that I was writing this book, I kept interviewing her and taking detailed notes. And she used to talk about the wonderful Muslim friends that we had in Baghdad. And one day I said to her, "Did we have any Zionist friends?" And she looked at me as if it was a very strange question. And she said, "No, Zionism is an Ashkenazi thing. It's nothing to do with us." And I think this was typical of the attitude of the majority of Iraqi Jews. There were some religious Jews, there were some who wanted to go to Israel. There were some very poor people who wanted a break and were happy to leave Iraq. But the great majority, and there was a large middle class, wealthy, comfortable middle class, who were happy in Iraq and had no interest in going to Israel, because Zionism was a movement by European Jews for European Jews. The concept of a Jewish state was alien to us. Zionism changed everything, because Zionism, for the first time, gave the Jews a territorial dimension. There was now a Jewish state, so any Arab right-winger, any Arab nationalist, any Arab anti-Semite who didn't like Jews could now say to Jews, you don't belong here. You're outsiders, you're aliens, you're foreigners. Why don't you go and join your brothers in the new states of Israel? So there was a backlash against the Jews throughout the Arab world as a result of the establishment of the State of Israel. And the Iraqi army fought in the war for Palestine. And after the defeat of the Arab armies in Palestine, there was more of a backlash against the Jews in the rest of the Arab world.
Of course, viewed from Israel, a large Jewish community, such as the community in Baghdad, was precisely the reinforcement demographically that the young state of Israel was looking for after 1948. And so there was a real press to try and encourage immigration from Iraq, as from the rest of the Arab world, from Egypt, from Syria, from Yemen, to make Aliyah to Israel. And one of the most controversial revelations of your book, Three Worlds, was new evidence that an old rumor that security agents from Israel were responsible for bombs in Baghdad to provoke flight from Iraq out of fear is now being substantiated by new evidence that you have found. Could you talk a little bit about the whole controversy about Israeli actions to provoke Iraqi Jews to go to Israel?
In June 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law that said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register to leave on a one-way visa. And at that time, there were 135,000 Jews in Iraq. 2 years later, there were less than 10,000 Jews left in Iraq. About 125,000 Jews left Iraq for Israel in an organized aliyah. And individual experiences varied, but for the community as a whole, the experience was like that of a tree being pulled by the roots.
But Avi, I'm going to take you back,
yes,
because I want to talk about that experience and your families.
Yes.
But the bombs.
The bombs. So initially, only a few thousand Jews registered to leave Iraq. And then in the following year, 5 bombs were exploded in Jewish premises in Baghdad. It's not part of my argument that the bombs were the main cause for the exodus of the Jews from Iraq. The main reason was persecution of the Jews after the 1948 by the government. Jews were dismissed from the government service. Restrictions were imposed on the activities of Jewish merchants and bankers. Quotas were imposed on the number of Jews who could go to university. The main reason for the exodus was persecution. But the bombs were a factor that needs to be taken into account. And in Israel, there are always rumors by Iraqis. They always suspected that the Mossad had a hand in the bombs, and that fueled the resentment of being, as they saw it, being forced to leave Iraq and to go to Israel. I was always interested in these rumors, but they were persistently denied that Israel had any hand. But when I was working on this book, I came across 2 sources of evidence that the Mossad was involved. One was Yaakov Karkukli, an elderly Iraqi Jew, a friend of my mother, who was in the Zionist underground in Baghdad, and he told me all about their activities, including the bombs. And The other source of evidence is a police report that he gave me, Karkukli gave me, which is one page with inside information that no one else could have had. It came from a police report, and it named Yosef Basri, who was a Jewish lawyer, ardent Zionist, a member of the Zionist underground, and it was a report about his interrogation, and he confessed to planting 3 out of the 5 bombs. The other 2 were unrelated to the Jews, and not, but the 3 bombs he planted. And there was a trial. He was tortured, of course, he was tortured, and he confessed. But he was only charged with planting the bombs for which he was responsible. And it was a proper trial, it wasn't a show trial. All the foreign press were invited, all the embassies were invited, and it was a proper trial. He was convicted.
Okay, but let me push you a little further, because obviously the man was tortured, and so evidence obtained under duress. Do you think that's really going to withstand the scrutiny of, let's say, those who will continue to deny that Israel had any hand in the bombing at all? It's not as clean-cut a source as, let us say, the eyewitness account from your mother's friend in Ramat Gan.
The combination of the written evidence and the very detailed oral evidence makes me completely certain that the Mossad, through its, the Zionist underground, had a hand in the bombings. And I have another reason for being completely confident that the evidence is incontrovertible. There is an Iraqi journalist called Shamil Abdel Kader who wrote a book in Arabic on the Zionist underground and the migration of the Jews from Iraq. And I made contact with this journalist, and I sent him the police report that I had, and I asked him whether it was authentic, and he said, yes, it is. And he has the whole file, which is 258 pages, and this comes from the police file. And I asked him whether he would share the long police file with me, and he refused to, so I don't have the entire file, but he confirmed that this is authentic evidence. So I now believe that I found incontrovertible evidence that Israel, the Mossad, had a hand in the uprooting of the Jews in Iraq. I'll say something else, Eugene. My critics don't deny this, but what they say is that it was anti-Semitism that drove the Jews, not the bombs. And my answer to them is, even if I knew for sure that not a single Iraqi Jew left Iraq to go to Israel because of the bombs, I would still condemn Israel, because Israel was created as a haven for Jews fleeing persecution. Israel was not created in order to frighten Jews into leaving their homelands, and Israel was not created to recruit local Jews to turn them into terrorists against their own people. So this is a real indictment of the state of Israel.
But needless to say, the debate goes on. There remain a lot of people in Israel totally unpersuaded by Avi's arguments, and it's made for quite a controversy both in Britain. I remember when your publishers took the book to the Jewish Book Week, they were told politely, no, this is not one for us. So if we're looking for where in this book you might find controversy, I think that's probably the place. But let's move on, because we spent most of our time in one of your 3 worlds. Could you talk a little bit about your family's experience then of leaving Baghdad for Israel? How did you travel? How were you received in Israel when you arrived there? If you could talk a little bit about the experience of transition from one world to the next.
We were privileged. We were wealthy Jews. My mother had a British passport. When the situation became volatile when Jews no longer felt safe in Iraq. My mother wanted to leave. My father did not want to leave. He wanted to stay. Eventually, she persuaded him to leave. She said it wouldn't be safe for the children. So my mother had a British passport. Her mother had a British passport. And my two sisters and I were added to my mother's British passport. And we left on a regular flight from Baghdad to Nicosia in Cyprus. We stayed in a hotel for a couple of months. Then we got on a boat and we ended up in Haifa, where my mother's uncle received us, and we stayed with him. So we were spared the experience of the great majority of Iraqi Jews who arrived in Israel. When they arrived at the airport, they were sprayed with insecticide, DDT, which was a very humiliating experience when they arrived at the Promised Land, and then taken to transit camps, to Ma'abarot, where conditions were very, very primitive, very harsh. Everything was uncomfortable, and they had lost everything. They arrived with one suitcase and 50 dinars, so they were penniless, and many of them felt trapped. My father was an Iraqi. He eventually sold what he could of his business, a very small amount. He lost most of his fortune, and he crossed the border. He left Iraq illegally with the help of the Kurds into Iran, and he arrived in Tehran, and then he joined us in Israel a year or so later. It was a very harrowing journey. My mother said he aged a lot, and when he arrived in Israel, my mother was in her late 20s, my father was 50, I was 5 years old, and my father never recovered. My father didn't learn Hebrew properly. He tried a couple of ventures which failed, and he was basically unemployed, and he was a broken man, and he was silent. And he never talked about the past. He never complained about the past. He was silent. And at the book launch for this book at the Middle East Center, our daughter was there, Tamar, and I mentioned her, and I said, my father was completely silent, and her father never stops talking. But my mother was more resilient, and when the money ran out, we bought a small flat in Ramat Gan. When the money ran out, it's my mother who went to work as a telephonist in Ramat Gan town hall, and she became the breadwinner. But it was very hard for my parents, for both of them. The strains were too great, and eventually they got divorced. So their marriage didn't survive the upheaval and the move from Iraq to Israel.
It's really heartbreaking because, you know, this uprooting, you started talking about the uprooting of the Iraqi community, and then I cut you off to go back to the bombs. But I mean, we get a real sense in your own atomic family's experience of how for your mother, her ability to adapt, your father, his inability to adapt, and then the pressures on their marriage. But to be honest, you didn't look so thrilled with being in Israel yourself. We have another photograph. This one's on the front cover of the book. And by the way, go out and buy this book. It is such a great read. But if you look at the young Avi here, this is a picture of him in a classroom in Israel. And he's once again staring straight at the camera. Gone are the brass buttons on the waistcoat and the tie. He's in a sort of dun polo shirt. And he's looking up from a well-filled-in copybook as if to say, can I go back to exile now? It was better than this place. What was your experience of abandoning a world of servants and luxury to making life in the utilitarian Israel of the 1950s?
In Israel, I had a sense of inferiority for being an Iraqi boy. Because Israel was an Ashkenazi society, European Jews created the state of Israel, and everything Arab was considered inferior. There was a lot of racism. Arabs were considered very backward, very primitive. The Arabic language was considered a primitive and an ugly, guttural language. And I, as a 5-year-old boy, didn't experience direct discrimination, but it was all in the air. And I absorbed the values of my new society, and I felt very inferior because I was an Iraqi boy in a European-style society. And this sense, this very heavy chip on my shoulder, this sense of inferiority governed my relationship with Israeli society. And it wasn't until after I left Israel that I was able to look at my own experience differently. But in Israel, I never had a sense that I was talented, bright, or promising, and that I was being held back. I just felt naturally inadequate and alienated from my society, so it wasn't a happy childhood.
But you learned Hebrew fluently, and you rather lost your Arabic. I mean, you had to relearn Arabic, which would have been your mother tongue.
Children learn languages very quickly, so my sisters and I learned Hebrew very quickly, and at home my parents spoke only Arabic, and they spoke to us in Arabic, and we would reply in Hebrew. But I left Baghdad when I was 5 years old, before I was going to school, before I started going to school. So I couldn't read or write Arabic, and then I forgot Arabic. But because my main research interest is the Arab-Israeli conflict, in Oxford I learned to read and write Arabic.
So he now speaks Arabic with a proper Oxford accent. We are running the clock down. I'm told by reliable sources here that after the 45 minutes on the clock, where there's about 5 minutes leeway. And I want to give you, dear audience, a good 10 minutes to ask your questions. So, Avi, we've got about a minute and a half, and I've got 2 more questions for you. We've dwelt now a little bit on your second world. You left Israel for Britain to complete high school and to go to university in Cambridge. You were obviously a foreigner when you arrived in Britain. But were you an Iraqi or were you an Israeli?
That's a good question, because I had a crisis of identity when I arrived in London, and I went to the Jewish Free School in Camden Town, which was an Orthodox Jewish school and an ardently Zionist school. Everyone asked me about Israel and being an Israeli. And they wanted me to say that how we made the desert bloom and how we fought the Arabs. But I didn't feel comfortable with this identity. I didn't want to cash in on my Israeli identity. No one ever asked me anything about Iraq. So I did have a crisis of identity. I didn't know who I was, but eventually I managed to resolve this crisis and settle on being British.
Which is exactly the Avi Shlaim I met when I took up my job in 1991. The Anglo-Israeli, who was a leading member of the Israeli New Historians, who were making a name for themselves in rewriting the history of Israel on the basis of Israeli documents in a way which totally upturned the official narrative. But there was to be one more transformation in your identity politics that I think writing Three Worlds was to provoke. In a sense, I feel in reading the book that you've had an awakening or a reawakening of your Iraqi origins. I'm thinking of the work of Ella Shohat, who has been very influential in setting out a discourse about the Arab Jew, and I think you now have come to situate yourself squarely in that identity discussion. Do you want to talk a little bit about rediscovering your Arab Jewishness, or Jewish
Yes.
Arabness?
You've just done it for me very eloquently.
Thank you.
So I'm one of the new historians. The other two original ones were Benny Morris and Ilan Pape. In 1988, we published books, and between us, we launched a frontal attack on all the myths that have come to surround the birth of Israel and the first Arab-Israeli war.
But the Arab Jew? Sorry,
So,
I'm looking at the clock.
So, throughout my work, scholarly work, I always knew that the Palestinians were the main victims of Zionism. And when I started working on this book, I realized that there was another category of victims of Zionism, and they were the Jews of the Arab lands. And Ella Shohat's book was an eye-opener for me. She's an Iraqi-Israeli who is a professor in New York, and she wrote a book, a collection of essays on the Arab Jew, Palestine, and other displacements. And I learned a lot from her, and I was able to put my own experience in some sort of a framework. As you know, Eugene, I'm just a storyteller. I'm not a profound thinker.
I beg to differ.
But Ella Shohat enabled me to put my own experience in a much wider intellectual and political framework.
You put it beautifully, Avi. It's in listening to others that we often develop our own thinking, which is why I want to give this amazing audience, which has continued to grow. Obviously, word's gone out. Avi Shlaim's over in the Durbar Hall. They've been filling in since we started. But audience, I'd like to give you the time, and I already see a hand here. I assume we have roving mics, and then in the front row. And this side, please don't fail me. We'll take these two.
Thank you.
Very quick and sharp, please, and Avi, quick answers.
Thank you very much, Eugene and Avi. You both are captivating and really courageous. I was just wondering, what does it say about Israel that it appears that they never had a unifying force like my country's first Prime Minister, Nehru, who envisaged a multi-ethnic secular society, progressive in its nature, and some might argue that he is still the country's leading opposition leader as well. But what does it say about Israel that we never seem to have a unifying force since the time of its birth?
Israel is a nation of immigrants. It was always deeply divided, many cleavages between religious Jews and secular Jews, between Palestinian citizens and Israelis, between rich and poor, right and left. So Israel has always been a fragmented society, but there was one unifying force, and that's the Arabs. And that is why Israeli leaders from Ben Gurion onwards have always greatly exaggerated and inflated the Arab threat as a way of unifying Israeli society.
Gentleman right here.
I want your comment on Gandhiji's view on Arab, Jewish people going to Palestine. He said, Palestine belongs to the Arabs the same way the England belongs to English or France belongs to the French. It is wrong and inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs.
This is Gandhi.
So what is your, Gandhi wrote letter in 1938. He said, Jews should be settled wherever they are in Europe because they have right to be there. For millennia they were living there. Thank you.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
That was the shortest answer yet.
Thank you. It was an amazing morning. Would you consider writing a book in the future where the Arabs, as rightly said, get their place and their own identity? Arabs in that area, the land which belonged to them, they have lost. Can you not do something with your emotions of having grown in Iraq, that they get their identity, their rights, and they are not murdered?
The narrative in this book ends when I was 18, but there is a long epilogue in which I trace the evolution of my thinking about Israel and Palestine. And where I end is exactly where you suggested that I might end, and that is, I think that the two-state solution is dead because of Israeli expansionism, Israeli settlements. There can't be a viable Palestinian state, and therefore I now advocate one state from the river to the sea with equal rights for all its citizens, regardless of ethnicity and religion.
We have 2 minutes, and the faster we get through questions and answers, the more of you I can take. And just to break the patriarchy, I had a lady over here. Would you raise your hand again? Oh, I hadn't seen you, but I'm glad to. Can we have the mic over here, please? Yeah?
Hi. So there's this myth that the Holy Land has always been at war. And when I was over in Bethlehem, and I heard many Christians and Muslims, Palestinian Christians and Muslims, talking about the loss of their brothers and sisters, their Arab Palestinian brothers and sisters, Jewish brothers and sisters. And there was a longing and an emptiness for that to come back and for like the family to be united. What do you see as some of the first healing steps forward? I hear a lot about, two-state, one state, but what is that first step in that direction?
Bethlehem is a Christian city with a Christian majority. In recent decades, more and more Christians have been leaving Bethlehem to go abroad. The official Israeli explanation is that it's Muslim intolerance that drives the Christians away from the Holy Land. And my belief is that it is it's Zionism, it's Israeli expansionism, it's Israeli oppression of all Arabs, Muslims and Christians that is driving the Christians out of Israel.
Dear audience, I wish we had more time on the clock because there's so many more questions to put to this man. I just want to close by saying, A, you guys are amazing. B, this book is superb. And C, give it up for Avi Shlaim.